As it's ordinarily understood, grief is an emotion that arises in response to the death of a loved one. It endures a certain length of time, and then, under ordinary circumstances, gradually it passes. In her book, Time Lived Without Its Flow, the poet and philosopher Denise Riley presents a different picture of grief as she experienced it after the unexpected death of her adult son. It's not that she experienced a different emotional state for a period of time.
It's rather that time itself came to a stop.
You might say that as she presents it, grief is not something that happens in time,
but rather something that happens to time.
There's a suggestion that when we're in close proximity to death, time itself gets a bit wonky. Grief is an emotional response to the death of a loved one, and it can be overpowering in the period immediately following a loss. But typically, although certainly not always, that feeling of grief diminishes with time. That as the months pass, as the years pass, a person comes to reoccupy the rhythms and patterns of ordinary life. The feeling of the loss is less present to them. And while we never fully recover from the loss, it does seem that we grieve less with time. And that presents a certain kind of philosophical problem, that the object of the emotion, the person that we've lost, does not change over time. So why does the emotion change over time? Why should our emotion change if what the emotion is an emotional response to doesn't change? One response to this problem is to say that it's a failure or a weakness on our part that grief does diminish, that it would be right not to grieve any less as time passes. But that response seems to be both psychologically implausible as well as overly demanding of us and our grieving. Another response might be to say that time heals all wounds. But there are at least two problems with that response. The first is that it doesn't seem to be time that heals the wound. It's not that if you just wait it out long enough, the grief will go away. It is through grieving that grief diminishes. It seems that grieving is required for us to grieve less. And also that expression, time heals all wounds, I think wrongly connects grief to a wound. That what happens with a wound is you've been injured and you just wait for the wound to heal. It's something that happens without any work of any conscious or deliberate nature on your part, that the body just takes care of it. And with grief, this is something that isn't subpersonal in the way that a physical injury is. It's something that you need to do, and it is something about you. What's more, when we recover from injuries, we look forward to the wound healing. We look forward to being whole again. But with grief, there's this further sadness that often accompanies the recovery from grief, which is a feeling of almost guilt sometimes that you are no longer as preoccupied with the loss as you were before. So that we don't simply look forward to getting rid of grief. We don't grieve in order to get past the grieving, but rather the diminution of grief is one part of what is painful and difficult about the process of grieving. Now, this problem that I just described about how we can characterize grief and how it is that grief changes over time, even though the object of grief doesn't change over time, is sometimes called by philosophers the problem of resilient grief. And while Denise Riley doesn't address the problem of resilient grief directly in her book, Time Lived Without Its Flow, I think she offers a very interesting response to the problem. So, Time Lived Without Its Flow mostly consists of a series of diary-like entries that she recorded in the 3-year period after the unexpected death of her adult son. There's also a short preface as well as a longer postscript in which she reflects on the phenomenon, which she characterizes principally as one in which she was outside of time in some important sense. That she kept on doing things. She was responding to messages of condolence. She was taking care of funeral arrangements and so on and so forth. But in some important sense, she experienced herself as not inhabiting time as she had before. And one of the things I think is interesting about this experience from a philosophical perspective is that the whole problem of resilient grief is one that deals with time. There's this question of how is it that this emotion, grief, changes over time when the object of that emotion, namely the loss of a loved one, does not change over time. And the way that Denise Riley characterizes her experience of grief is not one of having an experience or having an emotion that lasted a certain length of time, but rather as one in which she was removed from time. It's not that grief is something that happens in time, as far as she's concerned, but it's rather something that happens to time. In examining this strange phenomenon of time coming to a stop, Riley refers at a number of points to phenomenological philosophy, and in particular the thought of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French phenomenologist whose major work was the 1945 book Phenomenology of Perception. And one of the central themes of phenomenology of perception is to take the human body into account as absolutely central to shaping our experience of the world. And one of the things that's interesting to Merleau-Ponty about the body is that it is both object and subject. It's a physical thing in the world that can get knocked about in all sorts of ways, but it's also something that I experience, as it were, from the inside, that my life is the life of my body in an important sense. So it's sort of a meeting point of the objective and the subjective. And it's precisely at this meeting point that Merleau-Ponty thinks that a robust phenomenology gets its hold, that he thinks that any attempt to characterize the world initially from either an objective or a subjective starting point is bound to fail. So the position that he calls the empiricist one, in which we take a scientific worldview and then try to account for all the phenomena in the world from this scientific objective point of view, he thinks will never adequately characterize the experience of subjective consciousness. But on the other hand, the intellectualist position, as he describes it, one from which we take the position of subjective consciousness as our starting point. He thinks we'll never adequately be able to make sense of what it is to be in a world that is independent of our minds. And so he thinks that in this meeting point of the body, we get a picture of a world where we can't describe the objective phenomena independent of the subjective experience of it, or vice versa. And this figures, among other things, in his discussion of time, where for Merleau-Ponty, time is not this objectively existing, independent flow of moments from moment to moment to moment, nor is it something that happens all in our heads, as it were, but is something that is constituted by our living in the world, by our being in the world. And one of the features then of thinking about time as arising from this interaction of self with world, something that is the self in some important sense, is that how we are in the world then affects how time is. So that if my way of being in the world is fundamentally disrupted, if my capacity to imagine myself forward into future possibilities is disrupted or stopped, as it is in the situation that Denise Riley describes, then in some significant sense, time itself stops. That Riley is able to draw on the thought of Maurice Merleau-Ponty in being able to characterize the way in which time might be something that is intrinsically tied to my experience of myself and my way of being in the world. Now, Riley is a poet as well as a philosopher, and a very well-regarded poet as well. And one of the things that she grapples with in Time Lived Without Its Flow is precisely the linguistic challenge of how is it that I can talk about this experience of time having stopped? How can I find words adequate to this experience? And she remarks on the fact that there just isn't much written about it. And she says this is not an uncommon experience, and yet, for some reason, is not much written about. And she talks about various challenges that she encounters in trying to write about it. Perhaps the most significant is just how to narrate something outside of time. So she points out that almost all narration has the form of saying this happened and next this happened and then this other thing happened. But if you're pulled out of time, then all those words like then and next no longer have any grip. That it's very hard to characterize what happened because the language of happening presupposes the movement of time. And what Riley characterizes instead is this discovery that time doesn't have an independent flow that you're just carried along by. And in this regard, she finds it helpful to advert to philosophers like Merleau-Ponty. She also makes references to Hegel and a number of other philosophers. But she spends even more time looking at poets. And in particular, in the postscript to Time Lived Without Its Flow, she spends some time reading poems by Henry King, by William Wordsworth, and by Emily Dickinson. But what she thinks she finds in poetry is not simply a richer or more precise vocabulary than what philosophers can muster, but rather that there's something in the form of poetry, the rhythm of rhyme, as well as the way in which language itself can be pushed past its limits, that is able to get some grip on the experience of being thrown out of time in a way that philosophy and more literal language is unable to do. And so I think one of the things one gets in Riley's work is not just a reflection on the nature of grief and not just a reflection on the nature of time, but also a reflection on the nature of language itself and the expressive possibilities and capabilities of language in both its philosophical and its poetic registers. If you found this video helpful, I would encourage you to give it a like and perhaps follow my YouTube channel. But only if you've got the time.